Welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we're exploring really a fascinating intellectual debate. It's right in the heart of New Testament scholarship.
Mm,
We've got this compelling piece of source material in front of us. It's Mark Mountjoy's A Methodological Critique of Bart Ehrman's New Testament Scholarship.
right. A well-known name, Ehrman.
Exactly. And our mission here is to pull out the most important insights from this critique. We want to help you understand its core arguments against Ehrman's whole approach to these ancient texts.
Okay.
So we're going to unpack three main areas where Mountjoy argues Ehrman's methodology kind of shows circular reasoning, maybe some inconsistency.
Got it.
First, how he handles New Testament eschatology, the study of end times. Second, what Mountjoy calls his unauthorized theological reductionism about Jesus' identity.
Okay, reductionism.
Yeah. And finally, his take on editorial processes in the New Testament, basically framing them as deceptive forgery when the critique argues they were transparent.
Interesting. Transparency versus forgery.
Right. Then we'll zoom out a bit, think about the broader implications. So starting this off, what really jumps out at you about this critique, this particular way of framing the debate?
Well, what's immediately striking, I think, is how it zeroes in on methodological flaws right from the start.
Yeah.
It tells you we're not just going to argue about interpretations or what happened when. We're looking at the tools, the methods scholars use to even get to those conclusions.
Good point. The process itself.
Exactly. And that raises a huge question, really, for anyone studying history, especially texts with these big spiritual claims. How do we make sure our methods are, sound, that they actually help us understand the original sources instead of just imposing our own ideas onto them?
That's a really crucial starting point. So the critique kicks off with what it calls Ehrman's most significant methodological flaw. And it's about this New Testament eschatology.
The end time stuff.
Right. Mountjoy argues that Ehrman tends to accept later church interpretations of biblical prophecies.
Okay, interpretations made potentially centuries later.
Yeah, potentially. And then he uses the fact that those specific interpretations didn't come true to argue that the original biblical prophecies failed.
Ah, okay. I see the potential problem there is like judging a chef's original recipe based on my terrible attempt to follow it.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
The critique says that's just a fundamental logical error. You're letting secondary stuff define the primary source.
Right.
For good historical work, you've got to grapple with the original text first.
Right.
On its own terms, before you start filtering it through what people thought about it later. Otherwise, yeah, you're critiquing a faulty copy, maybe, not the original blueprint.
So the critique insists on what it calls a proper historical method. First step, figure out what the original text actually claimed.
Nail down the original claim.
Then and only then do you look at fulfillment. And when you apply that method to New Testament eschatology, the critique argues, well, the picture looks very different. Mountjoy claims the real focus of that eschatological fulfillment, the thing the texts were actually pointing to, wasn't some huge cosmic transformation or a literal parousia, the second coming in the clouds, like later interpretations often stressed.
Okay, not that. So what was it then?
It was the termination of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, the end of that specific political and religious era.
Ah, okay. A more localized historical event.
That's the argument. And this is where it gets really interesting because the critique brings in historical evidence, stuff from 62 to 136 CE.
Right.
It talks about undesigned coincidences found in, hostile sources, people like Josephus, the Jewish historian, and Tacitus, the Roman historian.
Sources who weren't Christians, who had no stake in proving the Bible right.
Precisely. For example, Josephus notes that the daily sacrifices at the Second Temple stopped on July 14th, 70 CE.
Okay, a specific date.
Of a very specific date. Now, the critique says count back exactly 3.5 years or 12,260 days, a number that pops up in Revelation.
12,260 days.
And you land on January 31st, 67 CE. And according to Mountjoy's reading, this is exactly when both Josephus and Tacitus record these, well, frankly, bizarre, extraordinary aerial phenomena over Jerusalem.
Aerial phenomena, like what?
Things like heavenly battalions and armies fighting in the skies above the temple.
Wow. Okay. Recorded by non-Christian historians.
Yes. So
Yeah.
What does this timing mean for the critique's overall point?
Well, the argument is this precise timing seems to validate that 3.5 years time frame you see in Revelation 12.
Right.
And it potentially ties into the historical accounts we have of the early church fleeing Jerusalem, going to Pella for safety before the city fell.
Okay.
It even suggests this framework might fit prophecies like Paul's in 1 Thessalonians about believers being caught up to safety before Jerusalem's destruction.
So the argument is that these secular historians, without meaning to, provide this really precise chronological backup for the biblical accounts.
That's the claim. And it's not just the supernatural stuff. The critique also points to that whole string of political and military disasters for Judea between 70 and 135 CE.
The temple destruction, Masada.
Right, the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the siege of Masada, then the Kitos War revolts, and finally the absolute catastrophe of the Bar Kokhba rebellion ending around 135 CE.
Okay.
The critique frames these as precise historical fulfillment of warnings about the systematic destruction of Jewish civilization after, in the New Testament's view, rejecting Jesus.
This whole section definitely makes you think hard about how we handle sources and interpretations.
Yeah. It forces the question, are we judging the original claim? Or are we getting tangled up in later ideas about that claim?
It's a challenge for any historical work, really. Okay, moving to the second major point. The critique argues Ehrman consistently exceeds the boundaries of historical scholarship. How? By making these definitive theological statements about who Jesus was.
Right. This is about crossing lines between disciplines.
Mountjoy says, look, Ehrman claims he's doing neutral historical analysis, but then he concludes Jesus was, merely a prophet or revolutionary and explicitly not divine, which is what the New Testament claims.
And that raises this fundamental question, doesn't it? Can historical methods, just by themselves, actually rule on supernatural claims? Can history prove or disprove divinity?
That's the core issue.
The critique calls this a category error of staggering proportions. It says, sure, historical analysis can look at the claims people made, it can analyze the texts, but it can't definitively judge the truth of things that are just beyond empirical verification.
So when Ehrman says Jesus was not divine, the critique sees that as stepping outside his lane as a historian.
Exactly. It's framed as basically assuming judicial authority over cosmic questions. The critique even uses the word hubris to describe it.
Strong language. So how does Mountjoy counter Ehrman's view on Jesus' identity, specifically the idea that belief in his divinity developed later?
Well, he pushes back against that developmental hypothesis. Ehrman suggests, that Jesus started as a human prophet in the minds of his followers, and only later did they start thinking of him as divine.
Right, that's a common view.
But Mountjoy argues the opposite. He says high Christology, the belief in Jesus' divinity, was actually foundational rather than evolutionary. It was there from the very beginning in the New Testament text.
And what's the evidence for that foundational view?
The critique points to what it calls the systematic substitution of Jesus for YHWH being the Old Testament name for God.
Okay.
It looks at passages where the New Testament seems to apply descriptions or actions of God the Creator, taken from the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, and applies them directly to Jesus. The argument is that this shows a coordinated theological understanding of Jesus' divinity right from the earliest stages.
Interesting. Substitution. Any other arguments?
Yeah, there's also this proportionality argument. Kind of circles back to the destruction we were talking about.
The end of the Second Commonwealth.
Exactly. The critique suggests the sheer scale of that destruction, between 62 and 136 CE, corresponds to the gravity of what the New Testament claims was rejected. It wasn't just the human teacher they rejected, but, quoting 1 Corinthians, the Lord of glory himself.
So the magnitude of the consequence reflects the magnitude of the person rejected.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
This whole section really forces us to think about the limits. Where does historical analysis end and theological judgment begin? And why does that line even matter when we're trying to understand a text like the New Testament?
It's a critical distinction. Okay, let's shift gears to the third area, forgery. The critique argues Ehrman's claims about New Testament forgery tend to create crises where none actually exist.
So, arguing against the idea of widespread deception.
Yeah. Mountjoy contends that Ehrman's focus on supposed deceptive practices completely overlooks how remarkably transparent these texts are about their own creation, their own editorial processes.
Transparency. Okay, how does the critique demonstrate that? What's the evidence?
Well, several things. First, it points to open acknowledgments of scribal involvement and collaborative composition right there in the text.
Like the text itself says others were involved.
Exactly. It cites Romans 16.22, where Paul's scribe Tertius adds his own greeting. I, Tertius, who wrote down this letter, greet you in the Lord.
Ah, okay. He names himself.
Right. And 1 Peter 5.12, where Peter says something like, "With the help of Silas, I have written to you briefly."
Okay, so acknowledging collaborators or scribes. How does that contrast with forgery? Well, what's interesting, the critique notes, is that typical ancient pseudepigraphy works falsely attributed to famous authors usually went to great lengths to hide the real author and pretend to be the famous person.
They wouldn't name the scribe.
No way.
Yeah.
But the New Testament, in these instances, openly talks about its collaborative nature. The critique argues this points towards transparency, not deception.
Okay, that's one point. What else?
Then there's the criterion of embarrassment, which we touched on a bit implicitly.
Right. Things the authors wouldn't invent because they look bad.
Precisely. The critique argues that a text is less likely to be a fabrication if it includes details that are awkward, problematic, or just plain embarrassing for its proponents or central figures.
What examples does it give from the New Testament?
Things like the resurrection accounts not lining up perfectly on every single detail.
The minor discrepancies.
Yeah, or the disciples frequently messing up, misunderstanding Jesus, looking foolish or cowardly. Peter's denial, for instance.
Right.
Matt Joy's point is that any competent forger trying to create a convincing, authoritative document would smooth out those rough edges. They eliminate the contradictions, make the heroes look consistently heroic.
So the very presence of these embarrassing elements argues against deliberate fabrication.
That's the argument. It suggests a commitment to recording things as they were remembered, warts and all, rather than manufacturing a perfect story.
And there's another point about style.
Yes, and this one is perhaps quite striking if you read the Greek. The critique highlights the preservation of radically different stylistic qualities across the New Testament books.
Different writing styles, very different. For instance, the book of Hebrews. It's described as having exceptionally eloquent prose, really high-level Greek.
Okay, sophisticated.
Then you have 1 Peter, also pretty good, very good literary quality. But then you get to 2 Peter, and the critique says it exhibits notably poor Greek style, clunky, awkward, which Mountjoy attributes maybe to Peter himself, arguing he perhaps wasn't particularly skilled with Koine Greek, the common language.
Interesting. So attributing the awkwardness to the actual claimed author's limitations.
Right. And then the book of Revelation switches again to a very distinct style, heavily influenced by the Septuagint's Greek.
So not uniform at all. How does this support authenticity?
The critique argues this pattern of stylistic diversity actually supports the traditional claims about authorship, especially, for example, the link between Mark's Gospel, which has a sort of simple, direct style, and Peter's traditionally claimed influence on Mark. Peter wasn't known for fancy rhetoric.
Ah, so the style matches the reputed source.
Yeah. It suggests these aren't books all cooked up by the same highly skilled forger or group of forgers trying to imitate one style. The differences themselves become a kind of evidence.
Okay, that makes sense. So then how does the critique handle the issue of textual variants? The thousands of differences between ancient manuscripts that Ehrman often highlights.
Right. The variants are a big part of Ehrman's case for corruption over time. But the critique argues that framing these variants primarily as corruption misses a crucial point: the straightforward reality of ancient manuscript mass production.
Mass production. How does that relate?
Well, it asks you to think. Were thousands of copies being made by hand from the very beginning?
Yes, presumably.
And were any two of those handmade copies ever going to be exactly identical?
Probably not. Errors creep in, minor changes.
Exactly. The critique says this variation is just normal scribal practice for the time. It's what you'd expect when texts are being copied widely by hand.
So variants aren't necessarily malicious changes, just the nature of hand copying.
That's a big part of the argument. It uses the example of the endings of Mark's Gospel. There's a shorter ending and a longer one found in different manuscripts.
Right, that's a famous case.
The critique suggests this likely just reflects an early copy losing its original final page, something common with scrolls and codices. Later scribes, seeing the abrupt end, might have tried to provide a suitable conclusion based on what they knew from other Gospels.
So their attempts to add an ending show care, not deception.
Demonstrates conscientiousness rather than deception, is how the critique puts it. They were trying to preserve the story, not invent lies.
Okay, this leads to a really counterintuitive idea in the critique, doesn't it? About the variants actually being a good thing.
Yes. This is what Mountjoy calls a strategic advantage. He argues there probably never was one exact New Testament autograph, one single, perfect original manuscript to be preserved or lost.
No single master copy.
Maybe not in the way we think of it. Instead, the argument is that the variants themselves, the cloud of slightly different manuscripts, actually provide a hedge that preserves the conceptual purity.
A hedge. How does that work?
The idea is that even with tons of minor variations, Mountjoy uses the phrase astronomical numbers, they don't actually change the core story. The basic facts that undergird Christianity remain consistent across the manuscript tradition. This creates what he calls transmission elasticity.
Elasticity, like it can stretch and adapt without breaking.
Exactly. He compares it to human genetic diversity. We're all technically copies of Adam and Eve, the critique playfully suggests, but genetic variation allows us to be individuals while remaining fundamentally human.
So the manuscript variations allow for survival and individuality, but the core message stays intact across thousands of copies and centuries.
That's the argument. The core narrative, the key theological points, they're stable despite the surface-level noise.
Okay, but what about editing? Doesn't Ehrman argue that later editing after the Apostles compromises the text's authority?
He does. But the critique counters this by pointing to what it calls clear biblical precedent for inspired editorial processes within the Bible itself.
Precedent? Like where?
Primarily in the Old Testament. The critique notes, for example, that nobody tries to hide the fact that the Book of Psalms contains psalms written long after David, and that the collection itself was edited over time.
Right, like psalms written during the Babylonian captivity.
Exactly. Psalm 137, By the Rivers of Babylon. Clearly not written by King David centuries earlier. Yet, the critique points out, Jesus himself quotes from the Psalms, including parts potentially edited later, like Psalm 110, which Jesus attributes to the Holy Spirit speaking through David in Matthew 22, treating the whole collection as authoritative.
So the argument is, if inspired editing and compilation happened with the Old Testament, and Jesus affirmed it, why couldn't the same principle apply to the formation of the New Testament?
Precisely. It suggests divine inspiration wasn't limited just to the initial dictation, but could also guide the gathering, editing, and preserving process.
Okay, so this leads to a critique of the very idea of wanting one single perfect manuscript.
Yes. Mountjoy argues that Ehrman's implicit desire for that kind of single, standardized text fundamentally misunderstands the nature of effective preservation.
Why? What's wrong with wanting a perfect original?
Because, the critique says, a single monolithic tradition would have been incredibly brittle. Easy to lose, easy to corrupt, easy to destroy. One fire, one decree, and it's gone.
Like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Instead, this messy, distributed manuscript tradition with copies spread all over the Roman Empire and beyond showed remarkable resilience and adaptability.
It survived because it was spread out and diverse.
That's the claim. The critique points to the Bible becoming the world's most read book, Christianity expanding globally, as evidence that this method, however counterintuitive it seems to us, actually worked incredibly well. It reveals the genius of God's preservation methodology, as Mountjoy puts it.
And it survived actual attempts to destroy it.
Yes, the critique highlights things like the Emperor Diocletian's massive persecution in the early 4th century, which specifically targeted Christian scriptures.
Right, the Great Persecution.
And even earlier, opposition like the Sanhedrin at Yavna after the temple's fall, which condemned the New Testament writings. Mountjoy even mentions a fascinating linguistic attack where they apparently tried to rebrand Evangelion, good news, as Evangelion, evil news.
Wow. So systematic suppression attempts.
Yes. And the critique's conclusion on this point is stark. What survived these systematic attempts was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of a preservation methodology designed for resilience rather than vulnerability.
That really reframes the whole conversation about variance and transmission.
It does. It asks you to consider if what looks like a flaw from one perspective might actually be a feature from another. Are these signs of decay or signs of a system designed to last?
A completely different lens. It makes you think.
Okay, this brings us to the final major section of the critique, which Mountjoy labels the counterintuitive genius. This is where it gets really provocative, I think.
Counterintuitive genius. How so?
The critique argues the New Testament exhibits this strange pattern. It sets incredibly high expectations for itself, like making falsifiable prophecies, but then it seems to deliberately refuse to use obvious evidence that would seem to prove its case. Evidence that, the critique claims, any human forger would have jumped on.
Okay, hold on. Refusing to use good evidence, why would it do that?
Let's break it down. First, the falsifiable prophecy part. The critique points out that New Testament predictions are often tied to specific time frames, like this generation will not pass away, or Jesus telling the disciples they won't finish going through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes.
Right, those seem risky. Easy to prove wrong if the deadline passes.
Exactly. Critics often point to these as failed prophecies. But Mountjoy argues this vulnerability actually shows prophetic confidence. More importantly, it makes the prophecies hijacking proof.
Hijacking proof, what does that mean?
It means you can't easily reinterpret them centuries later to fit some completely different event because they're tied to that original context and time frame. The specificity prevents later manipulation.
Okay, interesting twist. But what about refusing evidence? That's the really odd part.
This is what the critique calls the silent validation phenomenon. It argues the New Testament authors knew about certain contemporary events, miraculous or highly significant events recorded by other Jewish and Roman sources that would have perfectly seemed to validate their message, but they deliberately don't mention them.
They omit perfect proof. Like what kind of events?
We touched on some earlier. The critique lists several. That scarlet cord miracle from the Talmud, supposedly happening around 30 CE, where the scarlet ribbon tied to the scapegoat stopped turning white on Yom Kippur, interpreted by some rabbis as God no longer accepting the temple sacrifices.
Okay, that would seem relevant after the crucifixion.
Extremely relevant. Also, the menorah extinction, where the main lamp on the temple menorah reportedly went out by itself. And the self-opening temple doors, witnessed by a famous rabbi, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who saw it as a bad omen for the temple.
Wow.
And those aerial phenomena over Jerusalem that Josephus and Tacitus recorded around 67 CE, just before the final siege, things the New Testament authors living in that era likely would have known about.
And yet, they're not mentioned in the New Testament itself.
Not explicitly. The critique argues this silence is stunning. Any human author trying to convince people, any forger would have seized on these external, seemingly miraculous validations.
So the argument is the omission becomes a kind of proof.
Yes. Authentication through omission, the critique calls it. It suggests the authors weren't desperately trying to manufacture evidence or force-fit prophecies onto current events. Their restraint suggests they weren't operating like propagandists or forgers.
Which is deeply counterintuitive.
It really is. Mountjoy sums it up by saying, where human fabricators would have claimed immediate validation, exploited every miracle, harmonized every account perfectly, hidden the messy process of collaboration, and erased all the embarrassing bits. The New Testament does precisely the opposite in every case. It seems to choose, he argues, prophetic integrity over apologetic advantage.
So the apparent weaknesses, the variants, the stylistic differences, the omissions, the embarrassing details, they flip around and become signs of strength, of authenticity.
Authentication through vulnerability. Like a diamond's flaws proving it's real, not manufactured glass. That's the core idea here.
It certainly challenges the standard critical approach.
Which leads to the critique's final points about the stakes involved.
Exactly. The critique raises some pretty serious questions about what it calls the reckless haste of modern criticism, especially when scholars like Ehrman so confidently dismiss texts that claim divine authority.
And it connects us back to the earlier point about misinterpretations? Yes. It argues, maybe somewhat tragically, that much of the evidence against the New Testament stems from the Church's own misinterpretations of biblical prophecy over the centuries.
So Ehrman's arguments maybe gain traction partly because he targets faulty interpretations that the Church itself has sometimes held up as the actual biblical claim.
That's the argument. He accepts flawed later interpretations as if they were the original claims, shows they didn't happen, and then uses that to discredit the original texts. The critique calls this a double tragedy.
Wow. Okay. And what about the impact on people?
The critique doesn't shy away from this. It talks about the destructive impact on believers, saying that popular critical works can cause Christians to stumble and drop out of the race, maybe lose their faith or confidence. It even cites Jesus' warning in Matthew 18 about causing little ones, meaning vulnerable believers, to stumble.
So it's bringing in a kind of ethical or spiritual dimension to the scholarly debate.
Very much so. It asks about the fearful possibility of divine accountability for scholars who might be leading people away from faith based on arguments that the critique contends are built on shaky methodological ground. It suggests the responsibility goes way beyond just academic circles.
And the final punchline is that this stumbling is often unnecessary.
Yes. The critique concludes that much of this crisis of faith is largely unnecessary because the arguments driving it rest on these alleged methodological flaws that, under closer scrutiny, don't hold up.
It's a powerful closing argument. Definitely makes you think about the real-world consequences of academic debates, especially when they touch such deep-seated beliefs.
Absolutely. So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for us, for you listening? We've journeyed through Mark Mountjoy's critique of Bart Ehrman's scholarship. We looked at arguments about eschatology, Jesus's identity, manuscript integrity, and we've encountered this striking idea of a counterintuitive genius in the New Testament itself, where things that look like flaws, like variants or omissions, might actually be signs of authenticity and resilience.
Yeah, this deep dive really pushes us, I think, to look beyond just surface-level readings or arguments. It forces us to engage critically with how scholarship is done, the methods used.
Right.
It suggests that maybe some features of the New Testament that critics often highlight as weaknesses could, if you look through a different methodological lens, actually be seen as these sophisticated ways of ensuring the message survived and spread.
A different perspective on resilience.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that there's always more to learn, always other perspectives to consider, especially when we're dealing with texts that have had such a massive impact on history and culture.
So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with. This critique pushes us to ask, where else might we be misunderstanding things, maybe in history, science, even our own lives, because we're using flawed methods, or because we fail to see the potential strategic superiority, as Mountjoy puts it, of simple truth-telling over trying to manufacture proof? What does real resilience, genuine authenticity actually look like, not just in ancient books, but in ideas themselves?